1945, just as a key milestone date, the world has been governed by what is literally, informally, a world government. And okay, you figure, well, where is that world government? Well, you can say it's these organizations that do all the planning, like the think tanks, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberg Group, and so forth. And then they control the corporations and the banks and the IMF and the Federal Reserve and the American government and the Argentine government and so forth. But it's really basically something that is behind the scenes. What are we seeing today? We are seeing a transition from an informal world government to a legally binding and legally enforceable world government, which is a totally different creature and which will require and is requiring huge amounts of violence. Why do I say this? Because we are getting to the point, and I think the IMF has been one of the beachheads at this, where they will use organizations, certain organizations, certainly the IMF in the case of Argentina, to enforce that which the private banks cannot do so. Let me give you an example. Citicorp, J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, HSBC, they cannot go to the Argentine presidential palace, kick the door in, and say, "Hey, you're going to pay my loan right now back." Or they cannot do that with the Ministry of Economy. However, the IMF, being formally a multilateral public organization, because formally the IMF is part of the United Nations. Argentina is a member of the United Nations. Argentina is a member of the IMF. Argentina is also a member of the World Bank. So if you as a state are a voluntary, quote-unquote, member of the IMF, well, you're going to have to do what the IMF tell you to do. So in comes the IMF kicking your door, literally, whether it be the president of Argentina or the minister of economy, telling them, you guys are part of this public organization. You must do what we say. So what is the function of the IMF? To do and impose and enforce that which the private banks can't do. Argentina owes, and I'm sure most every other country with a large foreign debt, relatively small amounts to the IMF. But it's the IMF that comes in, kicking the door, saying you got to do this with your economy, you got to raise taxes here, you got to reform your pension system there, you've got to reduce this here, and the government will have to bow down to them because we are formally a part of that technically public institution. So I can't really see that happening in America, because I can't see the IMF ruling in America, because in a way America rules the IMF. Theoretically, you have a great leverage over it. But in a way, it is a sign of things to come. What so far has been persuasive, the sort of the carrot and the stick sort of thing, to make government sort of toe the line. We will be soon entering, and that is, I think, the reason for the violence of these terrible times. We will be soon entering what will be a legally binding and enforceable world government, of which the IMF is a very tiny little example, but it shows you the way it's going to work, and that is a sure sign of things to come. It certainly was in our case. The IMF literally collapsed the Argentine economy, because they were supposed to be the guys who audited all our numbers, and they would impose dramatic economic, financial, monetary, banking distortions that literally collapsed the country. But all the while, they would tell the investors, hey, Argentine bonds are wonderful. You should invest in them. That's why when we went into
Adrian, I know it's all a scam, every bit of it, all of the organizations. Even the United Nations. I called the United Nations some time ago to find out if they're a company or if they're government. No one at the United Nations could answer the question. Here's another question I want to ask you. On the so-called American dollar, at the top on the front, it says Federal Reserve Note, N-O-T-E, which defines what that piece of paper really is. It can't be a dollar and a promissory note. It can't be both at the same time. So I take it by the wording that it is a promissory note from a private company called the Federal Reserve. But I cannot find a legal definition at the Federal Reserve or anywhere else what the word note means legally. Do you have any idea?
That is one. I like that, because that is definitely one of the key questions. The counterpart of what you just mentioned for my country, for Argentina, is that there is no legal definition in the Argentine code of law. We have Napoleonic law. There is not one legal definition of what money is. What is currency? I mean, I've got in front of me an Argentine peso. What is that? The key question is, what is money? I mean, because if somebody says, "Oh no, it's something printed by the government," well, but when the bank loans me money, and they never actually gave me the money, they merely credited my bank account, and they allowed me to draw on the. Yeah, exactly.
It's not money. You
exactly.
mentioned a minute ago your country borrowed or is based on so many millions, billions of U.S. dollars. Well, there is no such thing as a U.S. dollar. They're all Federal Reserve, a private company, promissory notes from a private company that you borrowed. But you can't define what the promise is.
Maybe I'm going ahead of myself here, but one of the things that we're trying to do, and actually we're trying to do it, we're working on this project together with folks from America and from Europe, and one of the folks from America is G. Edward Griffin, whom I'm acquainted with, and we even shared a conference at the beginning of this year in the United States, and we call it the Second Republic Project. I won't go into that, but basically one of the key points there is let's define what money is, but a money that actually belongs to the people. Because you see, a U.S. dollar, let's think of a U.S. dollar in terms of a dollar issued by the Treasury of the United States. Okay, it might be in your wallet, it might be in my wallet, it might be in Joe's or in John's wallet, but
it's not issued by the Treasury.
I know, no. In your case, it isn't. But if it were real public money belongs to the people, just as the territory of the United States of America belongs to the American people. Then we can see how it is actually distributed. Some people have a lot of land, maybe others have no land. But when you define at least certain things, what is public and what is private, you're sort of on the right track. One of the things that we're trying to do is let's define money as a certificate for work. And you figure, well, what do you mean by that? It means that if you only made it legally binding, that the only way that any one of us and anybody listening to us, the only way you can get money in your wallet is by providing work. Physical work, spiritual work, intellectual work, yesterday's work, which you might have accumulated, today's work that I'm doing now, or tomorrow's work, which is a promise to work. And you made it mandatory for everybody to give something back to the common good, to we the people, in terms of work. And you only made 3 exceptions: those who are too young, minors; those who are too old, people who already finished their work cycle; and those who who have disabilities, who are for one reason or another. In which case, either their families or the public or the state or government has to look after them. There should be no kids on the streets. There should be no old pensioners under a bridge, begging for money and that sort of thing. But if you did that, you would probably solve half of mankind's problems, because the problem you now have, and you can see that in the figures with the last financial collapse that began in 2008, is that there are small but very powerful groups of people who wield huge amounts of money and who get a lot of wealth and do nothing. They give no counterpart of work. And it's because the whole financial system allows them to do this because of the way it works. And the proof is in the pudding, in a way. Your derivatives market is something like around now, it's estimated at 1.2 or 1.3 quadrillion. That's the financial overworld, so to speak. But if you look at the real economy and you add up the real economy of America, Europe, Brazil, Indonesia, Chile, India, and so forth, it comes out to only about 65 trillion. So how can you have a global financial system that in numbers is something like 100 times larger than the real economy? And that basically is because finance, which should always be subordinated to the real economy, which is the world of work, toil, blood, sweat, and tears, where everybody getting up and going to work from 9 to 6, that has been usurped, and now you have finance over that. And the financial system, especially in America, has grown like a cancerous tumor, and now it's metastasizing, and it threatens to kill the entire system. And that is in the financial numbers. And if on top of that, the Federal Reserve is going to go into quantitative easing too, and they're printing money, well, that's just going to merely kill the whole thing even quicker.
If you draw a vertical line and put the Federal Reserve and the banks on the right side of the line, and you put the people and the government on the left side of the line, the money is nothing. It can be defined as nothing when it's on the right side with the Federal Reserve and the banks. They've printed it. It has absolutely no value whatsoever. The people must cross that line and borrow the so-called Federal Reserve notes and then pay usury fees and interest on the worthless pieces of paper. when it crosses back over to the left into the hands of the people, the numbers on the pieces of paper represent the work units of the labor of the people, and it enables the governments to tax the people's labor based on the numbers of the pieces of paper that they have in their possession. And they have value. They have perceived value. They don't have any real value, but it's perceived value by the people. It's a con job that the banks and the Federal Reserve have put on the people, aided and abetted by government. So the people have to labor and work to get the little green pieces of paper. And they're under the gun. The government can tighten the valve and loosen the valve, make them work harder or make them work less by manipulating the values. What do you think?
You couldn't have said it better, because that is what it's so basically simple, but it's so subtle that I would venture to say 95% of the population in the entire world just don't understand it, because people do not understand what money is. And maybe a way to come to grips with that, and that's happening to you in America now, and it's happened to us, well, all my life actually down here in Argentina, is in times of stability, which practically none of us can remember now, but I don't know, for example, in the 60s and maybe in the 70s and maybe in the 80s in America and in Europe, or in the more powerful economies, when the economy is more or less stable and more or less foreseeable or forecastable, so to speak, it does look like an exact science. I don't think the economy is an exact science, and even though there are Nobel prizes for economy, and they try to sort of compare the economic studies with, I don't know, physics and chemistry, which are exact sciences, no doubt about it. But you can say, okay, it is more or less predictable. You can have econometrics; it is predictable. But as times of turmoil come about, and things get more and more volatile and more difficult and more unstable, the economy is really a branch of psychology. Because why on earth do people accept a little bit of paper that says Federal Reserve Note or Argentine Central Bank? Why do they accept that as a counterpart for a whole month's work or for a car they're just selling? Because we have a common perception that is worth something, that will enable us to buy something else. But that is basically psychology, and that is the extremely dangerous road that Bernanke and all his friends and all his bankers are treading right now, because the stability of the dollar is basically, and today more than ever, a collective psychological perception. You break that psychological perception because you pull too hard on the string, and it breaks, and the whole dollar scheme is going to come crashing down. And that is probably the greatest danger that is facing America now, and by extension the world, because most of the world in a way uses the dollar, at least for instance all of South America certainly does, uses the dollar as a sort of a flight to safety currency, as a common global currency.
But it's really not a dollar. It's a promissory note.
Right.
Exactly.
It's not a dollar.
But, Griff, let me ask you this, and Adrian, you too. What if the American government came to its senses? And I know this is a tall order, but what if they came to their senses and they said, you know what, IMF, go fly a kite? Then the only challenge we would have is we would have to live within our means. We could tell the people that hold our debt, I'm sorry, we can't pay for it, and they could choose not to conduct trade with us or conduct commerce with us, and then we would be forced to live within our means. But we could very well do that, tell them to just go climb a tree. We're sovereign, and that's the way it's going to be. But, the reality is I don't see them doing that. I really don't. I just don't know if if you notice, Argentina is once again, they never really lost their solvency, I guess you could say. Argentina is still a country. It's still there. Do you see the United States emerging in the same form that it is now? Or do you see a turbulent time and the emergence of a new government or something like that? I don't know. What's your take on it based on your experience of going through this?
Let me try and summarize this as much as possible. Mm-hmm. We have to then leave for a few minutes the financial and the economic, and go into the geopolitical. First of all, and this I can tell you, it's from Argentina's understanding. Argentina, the way the system is set up right now, even though we are an extremely wealthy country with huge potential and so forth, we are